The Out of Africa regime is now claiming that all Eurasian archaeology over 50,000 years is irrelevant or misdated, essentially starting a civil war within the field of paleoanthropology. However, their claims are not a careful, modest scientific inference, not a cautious update to a messy story. It is a formal proclamation from the regime to end argument, end complexity, and end dissent. The decree is the claim that all human remains outside Africa older than 50,000 years are not part of the known modern human genetic diversity. This is being presented not as a hypothesis, but as a verdict. And what makes it so dangerous is not that it is boldly argued, but that it is framed as irrefutable. As if Out of Africa has spoken, the court is adjourned, and every inconvenient fossil older than 50,000 years has just been sentenced to death, either declared extinct or reclassified as dated wrong. That is not normal science. That is total war against the archaeological record. Let's be brutally clear about what this new 50,000-year boundary really is. It is not a discovery that humans were absent from Eurasia before 50,000 years. Nobody seriously believes that. Even the very scientists whose studies are being weaponized admit there were earlier dispersals. The fossil and archaeological record is saturated with evidence of early Homo sapiens presence in the Levant, Arabia, and beyond, well before 50,000 years ago. This is classically Eurocentric. Because the oldest fossils in Europe are less than 50,000 years, then all Eurasians must be less than 50,000 years old. Once again, Out of Africa scientists are suppressing any evidence that does not fit their theories in order to control the narrative of human evolution. They build a theoretical border wall between Africa and Eurasia, and they control the gate. The real purpose of the claim is something else. It is an attempt to impose a clean break that protects the classic Out of Africa narrative from collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. In other words, the war is not aimed at the fossils themselves. It is aimed at the interpretations that threaten the orthodox story. Continuity in the Levant, continuity in North Africa, continuity around the Mediterranean, continuity across Arabia. Those are the concepts being prosecuted.
And why is this important? Because it tells us that human remains, modern humans, outside Africa, that are older than 50,000 years, cannot be part of the genetic diversity of humans that we have today, because all people outside Africa have the Neanderthal mixture today. And also all the ones that we have so far analyzed from the past have that same pulse of Neanderthal mixture. So if there are humans that are outside Africa that are older than 50,000 years, they represent a genetic lineage that is extinct, that we don't have in the record so far. So basically all this kind of early out of Africa movements, there's quite a few remains from Australia that are 65,000 years ago, from China 70,000 years, 120,000 years, from the Near East. Those all have to be lineages that are extinct. They cannot be lineages that are still present in the record today. And that's a possibility that they're extinct. All the other possibilities, just the dates are wrong, right? And actually, for some of them, it has been shown that some of them that were supposed to be 100,000 years old are only about 40,000 years old, right? It could be that all of them are, in fact, younger than 50,000 years. It's kind of hard to date this material because radiocarbon dating doesn't work.
Yet what did the genetic study actually show? Something narrow and technical. The shared Neanderthal ancestry found across sampled non-Africans is consistent with a major introgression episode dated roughly 45,000 to 49,000 years ago. That's it. A timing estimate for a Neanderthal admixture pulse. The paper is talking about when a certain ancestry signal became widespread among the ancestors of modern Eurasians. It is not a measurement of when humans first entered Eurasia. It is not proof that earlier humans left no descendants. It is not even proof that earlier humans were genetically isolated. It is simply a timestamp on a particular genetic mixing event. But then comes the rhetorical conversion. This technical result is smelted into propaganda. Suddenly, the 45,000 to 49,000-year-old Neanderthal pulse becomes the true founding moment of Eurasian humanity, and everything before it becomes either irrelevant or imaginary. It becomes a blade. Anything older than the boundary is cut off as non-ancestral. That is how the Out of Africa machine works when it is under pressure. It doesn't revise its story to absorb new facts. It declares a new boundary condition that sterilizes the evidence. It says, in effect, yes, humans were outside Africa earlier, but don't worry, they don't count. It is the old failed migration myth repackaged in genetic jargon. Let's be clear. Out of Africa is not just a theory, it is a political regime, and they will do anything to maintain institutional control over the field of paleoanthropology. They do this through media manipulation, funding control, and peer review. Out of Africa took an eraser to North African, Middle Eastern, Asian, and Australian Aboriginal history, erasing everything before 50,000 years. Archaeological evidence in Australia dated to 65,000 years ago must be wrongly dated. A 2% ancestry older than 100,000 years in Aboriginal Australians doesn't matter. Modern human teeth in China, dated to 100,000 years ago, doesn't count. Basal Eurasian ancestry in the Middle East and North Africa, a small contribution that doesn't matter. Middle Eastern and North Africa, modern human fossils dating to well before the 50,000-year cutoff, they are irrelevant. And here is the most brazen part. Because many key fossils cannot be directly dated with absolute precision, the new story conveniently includes an escape hatch by saying the fossil dates could be wrong. That line is not an innocent caveat. It is the psychological lever that transforms a hypothesis into a purge. It tells archaeologists that whenever archaeology contradicts the 50,000-year cutoff, archaeology is the one on trial, not the model, the fossil, the stratigraphy, the site formation, the dating method. The entire material record becomes suspect by default because it violates a theory that has decided it cannot be morally questioned. This is the moment Out of Africa stops behaving like a scientific framework and starts behaving like an ideology. The ideology demands that modern Eurasians descend from a single, clean dispersal pulse, that this pulse is recent, and that it emerges out of Africa like a lightning bolt, like a miracle, like a cultural bedtime story. A tiny band of fully modern Africans exits a continent of shadows, meets Neanderthals, then replaces everything else. It is a Hollywood myth of origin with a neat hero narrative and a neat villain narrative, and because it is familiar, it becomes protected. So when the evidence builds up, Levantine fossils, Arabian tool industries, Mediterranean connectivity, early Greek fossils, early East Asian relics. Out of Africa takes the eraser to anything older than 50,000 years. But the eraser doesn't even work logically. To leap from major Neanderthal introgression became widespread 45,000 to 49,000 years ago, to all older humans outside Africa left no descendants, requires sneaking in hidden assumptions. You have to assume that the only real ancestry is ancestry that survives as a dominant component in today's genomes. You have to assume the Near East wasn't structured. You have to assume population networks didn't exist. You have to assume early admixture couldn't have been diluted or overwritten. You have to assume genetic sampling is globally representative. You have to assume the story is a simple branching tree rather than a braided river. Those assumptions are not proven. They are chosen. They are chosen because they preserve the narrative. However, not every geneticist agrees with this conclusion, and this is where things really hit the fan. Basal Eurasian is the ghost in the machine. It doesn't behave like a simple descendant of the Neanderthal pulse population. It dilutes Neanderthal ancestry and sits in the Near East like an inconvenient monument to deep structure. It implies an additional ancestry stream in West Eurasians that cannot be neatly reduced to everyone after 50,000 years. If a Basal Eurasian-like component contributed to West Eurasians, and if it either had lower Neanderthal admixture or had a different history of contact, then the story cannot be universal. The very existence of Basal Eurasian means the Near East is not a clean staging ground for a single wave. It is a mixing basin, a reservoir, a living landscape of lineages. And once you accept that, the extinct story looks like a fairy tale. So what does the Out of Africa regime do when Basal Eurasian undermines the Out of Africa story? It does what empires always do. It does not negotiate. It does not compromise. It does not admit complexity. It declares war. It tries to annex Basal Eurasian into its moral territory by force, insisting it must still be out of Africa. That is the ideological reflex. Everything must be collapsed into the same moral geography. The Levant must never be allowed to be a true homeland. North Africa must never be allowed to be continuous with Eurasia. The Mediterranean must never be allowed to function as one system. Basal Eurasian must never be allowed to be an indigenous Near Eastern structure. Because if it is, then the entire out-of-Africa myth loses its clean break, and without the clean break, the myth is dead. Now notice the deeper problem. Even if we grant the 45,000 to 49,000 year pulse, it does not exclude long-term residence in the Levant. In fact, it practically invites it. The ancestors of modern Eurasians could have been living in the Levant and surrounding Near East for tens of thousands of years before that major introgression event. They could have been fully established, fully structured, fully interconnected with North Africa and Arabia. Then, as climate windows opened or corridors shifted, a subset of that population could have moved north into heavier Neanderthal zones and acquired the now famous shared admixture pulse. The Neanderthal timestamp would then mark a geographic transition, not a Eurasian birth. It would mark contact at a frontier, not emergence from Africa. In that scenario, Levantine humans are not failed. They are ancestral. But out of Africa cannot allow that scenario to breathe, because it dissolves the moral drama of the model. If the Near East is the true continuity zone, if humans were not bursting out but persisting, mixing, adapting, living, then the heroic replacement narrative collapses into something less clean, less preachy, less cinematic, and far more real. A long, entangled human history in which Africa is not the sole fountainhead of every Eurasian chapter, but a participant in a broader, Mediterranean Red Sea Levantine world. That is what the ideology fears. That is why it needs the cutoff. And let's not pretend the 50,000-year claim is even stable. The number itself is suspiciously convenient. It is not a natural boundary in the fossil record. It is not a magical threshold in behavior. It is simply a neat rhetorical line that allows the model to dismiss every earlier contradiction as non-ancestral. That is why it is pushed so hard. It functions like a border wall. It is not there because nature built it. It is there because the narrative needs it. They even use moral authority by trying to claim that their study shows the first Eurasians were dark, and then equate that to recent African, just like they did with Otzi the Iceman. But anyone who is not colour-blind and has any common sense knows that dark does not automatically mean African. It is just more dark than the average European. That is all that it means. Nothing more. But you cannot argue with this logic without having your ethics questioned. That is how, out of Africa, silences critics. This is what total war looks like in paleoanthropology, not armies and flags, but a war of framing, a war of what counts. A war in which the most powerful theory does not merely compete with alternatives, but tries to outlaw them. A war in which fossils become inconvenient witnesses and genetics becomes the prosecutor. A war in which uncertainty is selectively weaponized. Uncertainties in fossil dating are treated as fatal flaws, while uncertainties in demographic modelling are waved away as technicalities. A war in which the public is sold a moral story, we are all Africans, while the actual science is a chaotic tapestry that refuses to sit still. So yes, Out of Africa just tried to end all opposition. It declared that any human evidence outside Africa older than 50,000 years must either be irrelevant or wrong. And the fact that it can only sustain this claim by leaning on "or the fossil dates are wrong" reveals the desperation of the move, because that is what you say when you cannot actually disprove the evidence. That is what you say when the model demands obedience, not understanding. The truth is more dangerous and more interesting than their slogan. The truth is that Eurasia was not empty. The Levant was not a hallway. North Africa was not a separate continent of silence. Arabia was not a blank desert waiting for a miracle migration. The Mediterranean was not a barrier, it was a network. Modern humans did not step onto this stage at 50,000 years, as if the world began then. They were already there. They were already real. And no amount of scientific power grabs will change the fact that the fossil record keeps standing up in court, again and again, like a witness that refuses to die. Thanks for watching.